We are going to be talking with Sam Singh, Representative Sam Singh from East Lansing, 69th District, if I remember correctly, and Michigan State University social work professor Glenn Stutzky. And Sam, I wanted to start off the conversation with you because we're coming off of, I think, a troubling era where we're seeing a lot of politicians who have let us down, institutions who have let us down. And one of the more wrenching things that happened here in the local community, I think, was the ice storm and its aftermath. You had produced, after the ice storm and the massive power outages and how long it took to come back online, a whole list of questions that you hoped would frame the dialogue. Where are we now in the process of getting answers to some of those questions?
Well, as you mentioned, I think it was at the December 30th or 31st, I was putting together a series of thoughts based on a lot of feedback I was getting from emails and a lot of the reports I had been reading, whether they were online or also hearing about the public hearing that happened at the Lansing City Council. I think it was on December 28th. And that added a whole set of questions that I wanted answered on behalf of not only myself, but of course the constituents that I represent. And so I posed a series of questions. I put them on Facebook as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the things I wanted to look at was having a citizen review of what happened with the Board of Water and Light and so forth. And a version of that was created by Mayor Bonero. I think he could have probably started it and had the conversation about starting that group a little bit earlier, but eventually he got to the point where he agreed that there should be an external review. And I've shared those questions along with additional questions that came out after more and more material was provided. And I'm hopeful that this citizen review group that has some, I think, really solid community members from across the region, being led by Mike McDaniel, I think will provide us some opportunity to see what happened and what can be learned from a crisis like this. And that was kind of my premise of my questions was, where do we go from here? Because at that point, and we still are, I think, grappling with a lot of anger, a lot of disappointment, a lot of being let down. But at the same point in time, we need to be prepared as we move forward. And that's really where I wanted to spend a lot of my time as an elected official, kind of framing that conversation.
As somebody who's been around, working with police on community initiatives and that kind of thing, I've seen two kinds of panels, to be honest about it. And, the blue ribbon panel that comes in, it has some prestigious people on it. And one of its primary purposes is, in some ways, to give everybody a chance to sort of take a deep breath and look back. And if it's done honestly and it's done well, it really does dig out information that otherwise you wouldn't have. I think it's kind of what we're seeing with the legislature and, looking at the bridge closing in New Jersey. That it slowed down the process, but they had the power to get the information. They found out there was more to the story than anybody had realized, and they're clearly going to go forward and try to make some changes. Other times you see blue ribbon panels used to sort of deflect opinion for a while and they disappear and nothing much happens. Do we have a good sense of which kind of panel we have here?
Again, they've just started in the last 10 days or so of their work. So, but I think based on the people who are on the panel, just representing my region, former Mayor Doug Jester, former City Council member Beth Baton, former Township Manager Jerry Richards. I mean, these people have been around in our community, have a lot of, I think, respect from the general public, and they're not the type of people who are afraid of asking the tough questions. And then making sure that those tough questions have answers and that information gets out to the public. So I'm hopeful that because of the people that have been assembled in that group, that is going to be a very public process. Now, I will say, as they started, I had some concerns. Obviously the Lansing City Attorney, came forward and said that this group wasn't bound by the Open Meetings Act, and that might be true from a legal perspective. But as I kind of counseled a couple people who've asked me, is I think they should keep as much of their dialogue open and to the public. And if they decide they have to go into a closed session, do what local governments do. Explain why you're going into closed session. Make sure that that's very apparent and transparent in the process and show that there's some kind of underlying reason why you're going into a closed session. But I think by and large, there's probably 98% of what they're going to be able to do, they can do in public without, sharing too much proprietary type of information.
That was my big concern. As a journalism professor, clearly I'm a big fan of the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act. Those are the tools. What kind of scared me when I looked at the New Jersey situation as a parallel is without subpoena power, it seems to me that Open Meeting Act and FOIA are quite weak nowadays. They were much stronger 20 years ago, 30 years ago, after the sort of fervor of Watergate when these things came into being. Jurisdictions were really frightened about violating those rules and they were quick to try to get information out there. It seems that we've seen that sort of silt in and it's used in fewer and fewer cases. There are opportunities to stall. It's really going to take goodwill on everybody's part. And I guess the part that concerns me is I didn't think we saw goodwill on the part of BWL to begin with. And I'm not clear that I've seen a real expression of goodwill yet. I'm waiting yet for something that says, well, we're going to share this information with the public when we share it with the committee because we want to be transparent. I'd like to see something like that as a, a show of goodwill on their part.
Well, I do think, if you take a look at a couple of their commissioners, and I do think as you kind of walk through the process and some of the missteps, I mean, and huge missteps, whether it was one of the first hearings that they held and how they stacked the, conversation with employees first.
Actually,
Some of
Tim Barron first.
Yes, Tim Barrett, and then some of the employees, along with some other very large missteps that they took in their beginning. I have seen a couple gems, as I would say. Dennis Lowney, who's one of the commissioners,
Yeah.
pointed on there, has been very vocal as a commissioner, saying that he will have a transparent process, that he will be asking these types of tough questions, and so I think there is elements of the board that are wanting to do the right thing. But again, I want to believe that we are all here to learn from this. I think you're going to have not only an internal review by Board of Water and Light and this community review, but then this is also going to be reviewed by the Public Service Commission. And again, I think that is going to also provide some insight to us. So when you have three of these types of reviews, I think in the end, my hope is that the truth will come out, and then the lessons learned and what we need to do to change will come out.
I'd like to bring Glenn Stutzky into the conversation. Glenn does an interesting course in the summers, and it's on dealing with the zombie apocalypse. So he has his students say, "What would you do as emergency preparedness and coping with a disaster of that magnitude if that were coming to your community?" And it's a great way to teach a complex issue about how we take our institutions and what do they have to do to become prepared? How can they prevent disasters? What should they do when they hit? How do you improve decision making? When you look at something like the BWL disaster, it seems to be part of a piece of this larger picture. We've seen Fukushima in Japan, where the private corporation is still being allowed to take care of the nuclear disaster. Much to my surprise, I don't understand why the government doesn't nationalize that whole process and take it over. It seems to me odd that you would let a private corporation do that. But we let BP handle the oil spill in the Gulf. We never did take over that process completely. We helped, but we didn't make ourselves the prime movers in terms of decision making. How do these decisions get made, Glenn? Are they really legal decisions or is there a political element?
I think there's always a political element, that is involved in this. And part of the challenge, I think, is that these things are very complex. And sometimes even just the very size of some of these corporations and the agencies, while they have their basic plan in place, it doesn't go beyond. Sometimes you have to go outside of the box. You have to think
Mm,
of the unthinkable. I mean, Japan is probably one of the best prepared countries for earthquakes. But
right.
when you add on to that a tsunami and then add on to that a nuclear, situation, that's something that was never thought about.
Right.
So we've got to go beyond the traditional planning that agencies and businesses do so that we begin to think of the unthinkable. That's an element that has to be brought in. And one other thing I would say too is that as citizens, I think we've got to take responsibility to help our neighbors.
Mm,
Neighbors helping neighbors may be one
mm,
of the most powerful ways that you can prepare. In this course I teach about the zombie apocalypse, we just use that instead of a hurricane or a volcano or something. And a lot of people are concerned, well, what kind of food should I have? How do I purify my water? What weapons should I have?
yeah.
But one of the most valuable assets that you can bring into a disaster or catastrophe is your human relationships. That's probably the greatest asset. Knowing your neighbors up and down the street, and working together. I just wanted to bring that to the
Well,
conversation
that's
as
why,
well.
I've always said that community policing, whether you do it with the police or without them, the ideas behind community policing, which is really a sort of block by block neighborhood organizational approach. We can solve our own problems with crime. Half the time, we don't need the police to deal with them. We're much better off doing it in informal ways. You know, if you've got a drug dealer around the corner, let's deal with that. Let's not let the system come in and put them in prison. That doesn't really do anybody much good, and it just replaces the guy the next day. There's plenty of things communities can do to strengthen themselves. We don't see that happening in Grosse Ile because Grosse Ile has the resources to be able to deal with those kind of problems. We need to empower communities to deal with their own issues. The Canadians have always adopted this idea, and I thought it got lost in our ice storm situation. They warn people in Canada. They say, you're on your own for the first 72. They have a whole program called the First 72. Don't expect us to show up. It's going to take us a while to get our act together. We have to figure out what we're going to do. If we take off half cocked, we're going to make too many mistakes, which is, I think, what kind of happened here with BWL. People really expected their power was going to come on immediately. And BWL did not communicate that their first priority was we're not worried so much about getting the power on as getting those downed lines dealt with before we're electrocuting people. And when they found out how many there really were, I mean, that was just a massive task that I don't think they realized what they were facing. So part of it is that I think people do need to get the message that for the first 72, you're on your own unless you're in a traffic jam in Atlanta.
And Sam was saying, there has to be, especially during the beginning of any kind of a disaster, there has to be so much transparency. I was listening to something that the director of the CDC was saying just a few days ago, and just talking about the same thing, that you have to be very upfront with people. You've got to tell them exactly what's happening, exactly what you know, and exactly what you don't know,
Right.
and what you're doing to find it out, and just be honest with people, because there's such an anxiety that comes about. Yeah, I think most people were thinking the power will be back on a few hours. It always is.
Right.
Maybe a day at the most.
I hope we don't have to go to bed when it's cold tonight, but it'll be all right by the morning.
It'll be all right.
But again, when we talk about that element of communication, there was a point where the BWL said by Christmas Day, you would all have power back.
Ah,
And again, at that point in time, maybe that was what they saw, but there was a point in time after that statement was made that they must have known that they were not going to be able to get it back. And so the question is, how did you communicate that? And I think that's where a lot of people, I think, had a lot of frustrations. What we've learned already from some of the hearings has been, there was a system that they have at the Board of Water and Light that's supposed to show exactly where things have gone out and be able to call people back once they've called. There's some kind of technology that they utilize, but that whole system failed.
yes.
And once that system failed, the question was, what did you have in backup? And that's where I think people who were trying to, whether it was looking at their Facebook page, their website, because their phone calls were not going to the human being. And so the question is, how did you utilize, whether they were nonprofits or local governments, other types of systems to be able to get your message out? And I think that was something that we learned from this crisis that, they didn't do a very good job of. And so the question is, why did that happen? Does there need to be fundamental changes within their communications department? And those are the types of things I think we learned from very quickly. Now we're waiting to see the operational issues. And that's
Right.
what these studies will show us. Again, I think there were people who suggested that the crews that they had, that they could have brought in more crews more rapidly from other parts of the region, not just in Michigan, but in other states. They've now come forward and said, well, we did not have probably all of the relationships, these mutual aid agreements with these companies. Now they have shown us they have signed a whole set of those relationships since then. So again, we've learned something about the operational side. That's where I think we need to go. There's a whole set on communication, but then there's a whole set of issues on the operational side.
There was a concern too, because I attended that press conference at the firehouse on the Saturday following the previous Saturday's ice storm, where people were still without power. And it was one of the stranger press conferences I'd ever been to, because it was almost as if, why are you going to hold a press conference if you are hesitant to share information? There was a great reluctance to say exactly how many people had been out there at first and what their duties were. I, in the mid 60s, oddly enough, worked for Consumers Power in those days out on Parnell Road, and I used to be the person that looked over all the reports. I did nuclear specs for a while, proofreading those, but I also looked over the reports from all the outages. And consumers is not, me as a consumer's customer, they don't always engender warm, fuzzy feelings with me. I've had some problems with consumers. There was a fire on my pole when a transformer went out this summer, and it took 6 hours to get anybody there, so I wasn't happy. I could see my house, if a spark went wrong, my house catching on fire. But they have many systems in place that it appears BWL did not have. Not only did their systems not fail, there were some systems that were simply missing. You could go and feel that you could look at the consumer's map and see where the outages were. There was no similar kind of map that BWL had. So there was this reporting side. Were they really getting my report? I can't go to a map and see a little pin that says, yes, they know that I'm out of power. And what happened that I thought, when you're talking, Glenn, about community response, Jeff Ciardo built a map and shared it on Facebook and said, and it turns out I've talked to people in the community who took copies of that. And they'd run up to the trucks and hand them to the guys and say, here, you don't know, but your maps are wrong. Here's the maps that are the latest from the people in the community. So it is that community, they can fill that gap sometimes.
Well, that's one of the exciting things about, excuse me, about disaster preparedness and response is a thing called crisis mapping. It's just been coming about in the last few years, and even the CDC has a kind of a prototype that they're working on right now. And it's where you have social media,
Big data.
big data. And I see something happening and I text something in, you see something and you send a picture and it gets put on a map. So it's almost in real time where you have your citizens who are reporting in what's happening. And not just the bad things that are happening, but also where resources are as well. There's a guy called Patrick Meyer who's been a real leader in this. And he says to map the world is to change the world. And we can really play an active, role in this. It's been used. It's a crowdsourcing type of thing. And I think that we should look at some of these new technologies or new uses, for disaster preparedness and response. And in fact, it was already beginning to happen organically, as you mentioned.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing.
We did hear from the Board of Water employees at their kind of fall hearing. I wish they could find a way, and maybe this is the kind of thing that might be best done in secret. I bet they know what was wrong. The linemen probably know more about what was broke than anybody. And I don't just mean the power on the pole.
How the system was broken.
Yeah, I mean, they probably have got a good feel, at least, what could have been done better.
Yeah.
And then we may never hear their opinions because I think they're going to be blocked, frankly. I don't think anybody's got the guts to stand up and say, I have a 20-year employee of Board of Water and Light. I can tell you 5 things that we've been telling people for 10 years.
The only hope is the retirees.
Yeah. It's, in 2008 or 9, there was at least 25,000 people out in Lansing for 7 days because I was one of them. And I would like to know, I guess, if I could ask him a question is, what did you do between that period and this period? And nothing has changed. It was the same thing. You call, no answer. You couldn't report anything.
Right, you had the same problem.
Yeah, 7 years previous.
But it was warm.
The only difference was it was in the summer.
Right. I would say, the same issue during one of the legislative hearings, consumers and DTE talked about, maybe it was the same storm, I don't know exactly, but in 2007 or 2008, they had long periods of outages. And because of their conversations with the Public Service Commission, because of the hearings that took place at that point in time, they changed their systems. And a lot of the technology that they're utilizing today was based on kind of the lessons learned from that period of time. Perhaps Board of Water and Light didn't have the same capacity or whatnot, but I think where a lot of people were concerned was when they saw their neighbors, in Meridian Township with Consumers Energy or just on over at Williamstown Township with DTE, and they were getting data and information much more differently than Board of Water and Light.
Absolutely.
That created another level of anxiety and distrust by the community to say, hey, if, just, a mile down the street, people are getting this data about, I know you have my house, it's out. I've been told because somebody called me that I'm going to get my power back in 2 days. Those types of things and stories were kind of milling around. And I think that added to the anxiety for a lot of citizens who were long-term outages for Board of Water and Light during that time.
Well, when we looked at the emergency plan that they finally revealed, Todd Haywood and I were there at that hearing and did ingratiate ourselves with the local officials when we kept pressing for a copy of the plan. And I kept pressing Steve Sarkayan that Monday night at the Lansing City Council meeting because he still hadn't produced it. The plan was 12 years old, 14 years old. I mean, it was way out of date. These kinds of things have to be revisited constantly. And I was saying to Bill the other day, I have some compassion for people who are in municipal entities nowadays, whether it's city government or these quasi public entities, because we've had so many budget cuts in so many places in this state that people are doing the jobs of two and three people. They're barely keeping their head above water for handling the problems that come in under the transom today, and so they have no time to do any planning and any emergency preparedness. Glenn, one of the things you must stress in your class is that you have to think about these things before the crisis occurs.
That's absolutely crucial. You have to. And as I mentioned earlier, not just think about what has happened in the past, but what potentially might happen in the future. And to think about the unthinkable. I mean, think about this. What if, I mean, my one of my neighbors went 11 days. She was one of the last 500 people in Michigan, to have her power
Oh,
back on. But what if, I mean, to think about the unthinkable, what if the power didn't come back on for a month? We'd be in a whole different scenario.
oh yeah.
And that takes it to another level. So, you know,
And
um,
there are conceivably things that could happen that would make that occur.
yeah. And so it's just that we have to take some time to think about that. Even if we're having tabletop where we're thinking about it, maybe we're not actually practicing out in the field, but we think about
Yes.
that scenario. Because the Japanese never thought that they could have those three
Right.
disasters come one, after another. And there's just so much we can't control, that happens out in the world today. But we do need to take advantage of what we can make.
When I did community policing, I always said that what we really needed to do was use this for emergency preparedness. And we needed to marry it with an element of restorative justice planning. You and I have talked about restorative justice planning many times. The Searchlight Foundation had done something called community mapping, where they would send young people out into communities and they would go door to door and they would map the community in terms of assets and liabilities. And they would use an ice storm as an example. They'd say, if you have somebody in there who is in a wheelchair, and all of a sudden they're not going to be able to move anymore because of ice. Ice is going to make it, just too dangerous for them to get around. You need a neighbor who's on the hook to go check with them and make sure they're all right. You also need to map the neighbor who has a large enough generator and a big family room who's willing to have everybody over for hot chocolate during the day to warm. I mean, that's what you can do at the neighborhood level. I think, unfortunately, our neighborhood watch has degenerated into a very pale shadow of what it had once been. We are forming a new neighborhood watch out in my community, and I hate to tell you this, but one of the police officers issued a blast, the only one that I've ever heard from the guy in a month, and it was one of those urban hoaxes about a carjacking thing and how people were slapping things on the back window. Well, you know what? A police officer ought to have better information than, one trip to Snopes proves it's wrong. So that's why I'm saying I think communities maybe are resilient enough to start doing some of this themselves. I'm not sure big institutions are going to save us. We need them to give us the power, but I think when it comes to taking care of ourselves as neighbors, we need to have more of that neighborhood resilience.
I think, well, I mean, I don't want to lose the fact that there was a lot of that did occur.
There
Oh,
was.
yes.
There was, story after story of neighborhood associations and people going door to door
Yes.
amongst themselves to, take care of their neighbors and so forth. And so, I mean, we need to, put a focus on that, celebrate that, and then also see where could we go from there. One of the questions I
We could
had.
institutionalize it more than we have.
Absolutely, neighborhood associations and how do we strengthen those groups? How do we utilize that kind of people
Exactly.
power that we have in our neighborhoods? Because people are willing to do it. They just need to know what the tools are and what's expected of them.
And that's very true. Even when you think about when there's some kind of a crisis, there's what we refer to as the first responders, the police and the fire, but there's what I would like to call the on-site people who are there first. That's the teachers who are there. We've seen some amazing stories of where, people who have just were there on site have stepped up in those first few crucial minutes. So I really agree with Sam. If we can find ways to support those kind of local organizations or those people, let them know where some of the resources, where the resources are. There is, the United States has these different warehouses where we have medicines that are kept, I mean, huge warehouses for national crises. But the thing is that only the institutions really know about them and the institutional people. I think, having some kind of awareness, of
We
until
need
the
to map
police
those
arrive.
resources
Yeah,
too.
until the police arrive or until the fire arrive, where might this be, that resource be?
I look at an individual like Antoinette Tufts, whose new book has come out. She was the woman who talked the shooter out of shooting people. Remember the woman who said to him, "Yeah, I just got divorced and I wanted to kill myself." She shared her own personal story that way. She was not a trained professional. She was not a hostage negotiator. And sometimes, Glenn, you're saying that people on site have to act, and we have to give them some kinds of information and support so they know to go ahead and act and not always wait for the
Well,
professional to show up.
exactly like if you have a shooter that appears on campus, and you're going to be the first responder because you're right there on site.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, most of the fatalities occur before the police actually arrive. As good as their responses are, most of the fatalities are, already done and over. And so we do need to support some of these. How do we bring a greater awareness and even greater training, to
I wrote an article
the
because
local
I'm concerned about campus after the Purdue shooting, and we now saw the off campus shooting over the weekend. I wrote
Yes.
an article that's up on Lansing Online News. I know that the university at the higher levels has been working on some planning, but again, the communication issues are such that it isn't always shared with the faculty. I found out that even though I've been asking about it, that a report on what to do about an active shooter had gone up on the police website, but I didn't know it was there. I've been bugging people for months. Share it with me, and I never saw it. Now it's there, right? But the reality is that when you look at some of those situations, I teach a class of 260. If somebody steps up at the back of the room and stands up one day and pulls a gun, am I going to be able to go to the website and look for the active shooter checklist? Probably not. But what I would like to have is I'd like to have two things. I'd like to have technological solutions. I'd like a silent alarm on the podium, just like the bank teller has. So I hit a little button and the shooter doesn't know I'm doing it, but it warns the police that there's an active shooter. It's an active shooter button in the room, right? And I would also like training and simulations in advance. It's the kind of thing you do with your summer classes. I mean, it is that being able to do a run through first, isn't it?
Absolutely. Practicing, even if you're just practicing mentally, is probably one of the biggest. You have just better responses. So that is really key.
How do we prevent bad decisions, Glenn?
How do we? Well,
Seriously. The mayor of Atlanta says, and everybody says, let's all leave work at the same time. I mean, you're in the political realm.
sure.
How do we improve that communication piece?
Well, listen, I don't think we can always plan for every
No.
situation, right? But I do think, again, if you've thought through an issue, again, I think a lot of lessons that we've learned by this, BWL, crisis was one of the questions I asked the BWL staff not too long ago is if they have a checklist, if you're an individual who is sick, has a medical kind of condition, you can let them know. And what that tells them is that they shouldn't turn off your power. But then I asked them, what do you do for the individual when their power is out for now 4 or 5 days? Have you communicated that with somebody? Have you gone in and checked with them? Or if you don't have the capacity, can we talk to the police department or the fire department to check on those? And again, there wasn't a connection point there. Now, there might be some privacy issues. And so, I think that they've said they're going to change their forms to say, to the individual, let us know, but then you allow us to tell a member of the police department or a fire department in case of emergency. But those are the types of things. And if you hadn't gamed the scenario,
Yes.
as
Yeah.
Glenn is telling you, you would have never thought of that. But now, based on one of the people who came up to the East Lansing hearing who had signed up for that, she asked that question. Now, what about me? And that I thought was a very telling moment when you saw everyone thinking, yes, we probably could have done something differently because we had data,
Yeah,
but we
yeah.
hadn't made the connection to how to utilize that data and how to bring in other people. And so it's that type of scenario planning that Glenn is talking about that I think is very important.
And when you think about, as we're talking about relationships, which I think are at the very center of this, the BWL having relationship with other organizations, they don't have the capacity, to send out their people to check every single house. But if they have relationships with others, private or non, private or public, whatever, imagine how the feeling would have been different if after 3 or 4 days someone came by and they have to work out, the permissions and the privacy as Sam is saying, but you got to knock on your door and saying hi.
Yeah.
I'm just checking on you. I'm not from the Border Water Lake, but we're just here to check. Just how are things going? Here's a little bit of an update or something. I mean, what a different feeling that would have been.
Yeah.
He would just want to know that somebody is, knows what's going on.
and has their back.
Yeah.
Well, just a couple points. One of the things that I think is important too, it's just not the Board of Water and Light that needs to review their plans. It's every municipality has to look at them. It's
Yeah.
every person has to look at them. And when we look at the boards, the Board of Water and Light, it's water and light. So I think they ought to also put in plan right now, what happens if our water is contaminated?
Like
They-
we've seen,
Yeah,
yes,
they ought to be doing that
chemical
almost
spill.
simultaneously.
Absolutely.
Maybe not as quite as critical as the
Otherwise,
wind.
5 years from now, we'll be all of a sudden there's a big spill and we have.
They haven't done anything with water, and I think
Uh.
it would behoove them to look at their whole system, no matter what the crisis is.
We have to have water. We have to have fresh water.
I know.
drinkable water.
I know.
And people fight over water.
I'm
Very
writing
quickly.
a book, a women's survival guide for what to do with the coming chaos, because I personally believe we have a lot of unstable systems that, from climate to everything else, that are threatening. And I think women are a key here because we've always been good at relationships. We're always the ones that are saying, let's not fight it out to who has the power and who has the law. Quite honestly, the law isn't going to save us. I served on the state task force for the avian flu preparedness. And if you really look at it, people are persuaded that there's some sort of magic system in there where all of a sudden you're going to be quarantined in your home and all of this. And I asked a police chief once, I was down at Quantico, Virginia, where 135 police chiefs were there. I said, which one of you is going to issue a shoot to kill order when the quarantine comes down for bird flu and somebody starts to ask, what do you mean shoot to kill? You know, it's like, no, I'm not going to issue any shoot to kill. I said, well, then how are you going to enforce the quarantine? Well, we're not going to enforce the quarantine. I said, do you realize people assume you're going to be enforcing the quarantine? We think there are these systems that really aren't in place and can't be in place. We can't prepare for every contingency. We're not going to shoot people if they have the flu and come amongst us. I mean, we have to figure out solutions on our own at the community level, I think.
Well, and this is very real because just in the last couple of days, again, the head of the CDC has been speaking very, straightforward about the H7N9 virus that is growing in China.
Yes.
He made the point that during this week where they celebrate the Chinese New Year, there's over 3.5 billion, they call transits, people traveling. And
3.5 billion?
3.5 billion within this week of people traveling within China, getting together with family, preparing food. And they're very concerned because right now, while there's only been about 200 cases with about a 23% fatality rate, he said that, a year ago, this virus jumped from birds, to humans.
And
he
if
says
human to human occurs.
if it genetically changes, which viruses can do, he said we would have a pandemic,
Yes.
a worldwide pandemic within about 3 weeks. So these are real things that,
And it isn't really a question of if we'll have a pandemic like this, but when.
yeah,
And
it
so
may not
at
be
some
this-
point, it's very likely. I mean, the statistical probability is very high that we're going to have something like this. And then what do we do? Are our institutions prepared? Do we shelter college students in place? And if so, then how do we get food to them? How do we bring food in? Or do we send them back home? Or are they more likely to either infect others or get infected themselves while they're traveling? These are all questions that need to be thought of in advance. And it's an important issue.
When you
This
mention
is
that too,
LCC Radio, WLNZ
about
89.7.
different agencies cooperating. MSU was on break during that time. They could have housed a lot of people.
That's
if
true.
If two things might have happened, the winds could have picked up, and we could have had the weather we had the week later. It would have been one ugly place. I mean, I think we were kind of lucky. I know a lot of people don't think that, but
I think people
if our winds
people
were
would
at
have died.
25 miles an hour plus, and we had that cold weather, which just came right on the end of it, I can't imagine what would happen.
Well, see, that's another good point where you have to think outside of the box. Everyone knows the capacity that MSU has, in their residence halls and with their food. Yes, maybe they don't even actually have a policy about this, but I think it's something that needs to be thought about. If it happens on that kind of scale again, where we're saying, we're prepared to open up this place, and this place. Come on in. You're part of our MSU community. And for these days, we're opening this up. I think it's something that should come to the board of trustees. And when you think about a university, especially MSU, which is kind of contained, they're almost like, I don't necessarily want to use a religious word, but they're almost like an ark. We have food, we have water, we have power.
We have our own power.
It would be a great place to develop, the idea of a kind of an arc type of thing, where given a big enough magnitude, the university itself could open up the doors, in a responsible way.
And I think that's part of the planning that has to happen.
Yes.
Again,
Yeah.
I know we spoke a lot today about BWL itself and what it needs to do, but I do think you were right when you said this is a regional conversation. Local governments have to be involved in this. And I think as you have those conversations, what is the role of a Michigan State University in here?
Should it
Wh-
open its doors?
Should it have? Was it asked?
Yeah. Did
Was it
anybody even
even
think of
asked?
it?
Did anybody even think of it?
Could
Right.
could it have absorbed that, knowing that it's closed to a certain level, and so forth. So I do think those are kind of the next stage of questions on how do you prepare for an emergency like this. But again, that goes back to this whole concept of regionalism. And one of the things that I've said, beyond this, just these reviews, is that the Board of Water and Light itself has to become a regional entity. It is
Well,
in concept, but its board right now is currently only Lansing individuals, which makes sense as how it was formed. But now that it's taken on this different role, with I understand more than 33 to 37% of its power going outside of the city of Lansing, is how do we regionalize that board? How do we make sure those conversations are happening with places like East Lansing and Meridian Township and Delta Township? And how do we plan that? And so I think once we get through these internal reviews of the Board of Water and Light, I do think the next stage really is to have these conversations between the local governments and Michigan State University and Board of Water and Light.
One other thing I'd like to see is more aggressive boards. One of the things I think we've seen with Board of Water and Light is that there's a sort of passivity on the part of so many boards where as long as everything seems to be going along all right, nobody pays much attention. Even when things go wrong, it's more of a CYA than a let's make things better sometimes. And in particular, for things like the Board of Water and Light, I noticed that J. Peter Lark, the CEO, had his pay raised between 2006 and 2013. His pay went all the way up over to $330,000. And to me, somebody working for a municipal entity, that's an awful lot of money. And we're seeing that more and more in civic government now, where we're seeing these extraordinary paychecks for CEOs. We're seeing the people in the Treasury Department at the state of Michigan now who are making $300,000-400,000. I mean, it's a very extraordinary thing. At the same time, we're talking about not having enough resources to do things for planning. Even you could certainly, if you went from 120,000 to 330,000 in your paycheck, that's $250,000 over 10 years. That 2.5 million could go for a lot of planning. I think we need more aggressive boards that are saying, how are we using our resources? Are we using them the right way? Because there are some simple technological fixes. I will tell you that last Tuesday, Michigan State debated about closing the school because of the weather. The University of Michigan did, first time, since '78. I decided, because I had 260 students coming in the morning at 8:30 in the morning, wait a minute, I can go into the classroom and I can webcast. Just like I'm webcasting here tonight, I've got a free little program, do it right off my laptop, $90 camera. I went in and webcast my lecture and emailed my students the night before and said, if you really like me and you want to come see me in the morning and you don't want to, you want to walk through the slush to get there, come see me. And 10 of them didn't get the email and did show up. But the other 250 watched from their rooms, and that's a much better bet. I have two students, one of whom broke her kneecap and the other one who broke her ankle, just trying to get around campus. It's slippery, it's slick, it's hard. We have to think about new solutions. We've got all these wonderful new tools, and some of them are really easy to use, cheap, but what we don't seem to have is the opportunity to say, okay, let's do this at a university-wide level. How do we share that information? Train faculty. They could even do it from home. If you've got a good connection from home, you could webcast from home.
And if ever, and hopefully it won't happen, but if ever we have, a serious epidemic or pandemic, how are we going to continue to function as a society? How do we continue to conduct business? Our political system, our educational system. We need to
We're going to have
think
to
about that.
substitute the webcam for face-to-face.
I got a great question for you, Sam. Does the legislature have an emergency plan that kind of dovetails into what we're talking about on how to conduct business in one of these really awful, awful situations?
Well, I know the state police have a series of, plans for a series of events. I personally don't know, for each event what those plans are, but I know that, our community mental health and our human services groups, they've taken a look at a number of these things. Now, the question is, are those all up to date? Are those all at the point? I'm sure that we could always do better in all of those areas. But there are some of those elements. Even within ourselves, we take a look at what happens if there's a potential crisis at the building of the
Right.
Capitol, with an angry individual or whatnot. And so we've been told about some of those very specific things as it deals with us as individuals. But I do believe that, as a state, but as well as local communities, we have to be probably more aggressive on planning these things, as Glenn says, even the things that you don't expect. How do you plan for some of those things? Because that will help you, get to a better, place, especially when the crisis does happen.
One of the things that I worked on a project with that avian flu task force. One of our goals was to identify unique populations that are harder to talk about things with. I mean, how do you get the word to the Amish? You can't send emails. It doesn't work that way. You have to figure out alternative strategies. So to try to figure out communication channels for prevention in particular, because the big way that avian flu might well come here is literally with birds from China flying over and coming in contact with birds here in the United States. So we need to talk to people who raise these birds and have them out in the backyards, and that includes the Amish. So we have to have communication strategies tailored to all these different communities. One of the challenges we saw with BNWL, they didn't even have a communication strategy generally. But how do you get the message to the person who's hard of hearing, to the person who has no technology, who does not have a cell phone, who does not have all of these things? That's a huge issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's why we need to have these kind of conversations.
And we also have to look at, not call it old technology or old media, but we talk a lot about social media. But, even the way we've done radio over time, we don't have as much live radio or talk radio anymore. And so a common, use of this would be we should be on the radio telling people this is what you need to do in regards to this type of crisis. The question, really here at this station, what did we do here at WLNZ to talk about this issue? Those places
Well, we
where
didn't use the emergency channels that we had.
right.
There is emergency radio and there's emergency TV, and those weren't
It's
activated.
time for the ham radio to come.
But
make a
Sam's right. I
comeback.
mean, there could be potential to have a group that would come in here and broadcast 24 hours.
Oh,
With it, 'cause
absolutely.
It covers most of the city, most of East Lansing, I mean, there should be
Yeah.
plans like that in place where
Here's what
you've got volunteers that all they're gonna do is help you.
Here's what happened too, and there's another role for government. We have deregulated now media to the point that we've put commercial interests way ahead of community interests. We saw when Clear Channel gobbled up all the radio stations, there was that train derailment in Minot, North Dakota. And they're supposed to go on the air in the local radio station, warn people that the toxic cloud is headed to the town. There was no human at the station. They had decided that local news was not a priority. It's not required anymore under FCC regulations because those were deregulated at the same time. And I think we need to strengthen our regulation to demand that we have these systems. We're paying for these systems. They are our airwaves. We need to have more of this kind of emergency response in place.
Certainly, we asked that question, or at least I did, about MSU. What about Lansing Community College too? How could they have fit in? They were out.
Right.
They were on break too. So all those things really, we may be the luckiest community around because nothing ultra bad happened. But if we learn from it,
If we
if
learn
we get
from it.
smarter, I mean, I'm smarter. I mean, I've got some things put aside now. I don't have to run to Myers at 6 a.m. I've talked to our kid in Ann Arbor. What happens if we can't communicate? And they have the same problem, and we're looking at 2 days, 3 days. Where do we meet?
There's a huge.
There's got to be plans. You got to do that. I think.
Family planning, yeah, family planning.
Well, if we look back, we lived good lives 100 years ago, right? Without a lot of this technology. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the Iceman came with the ice on his shoulder because you didn't have a refrigerator, that kind of thing, and you didn't have a telephone in the house. So we can go back to that, but I think it's harder to go back. And the challenge nowadays is if we could maintain some power, or at least enough power at home that we could generate ourselves to have the new modern tools of communication, we stand a pretty good chance of, no matter what the catastrophe is,
I opened
surviving
up a
it.
Christmas present early.
Yeah.
I had the crank radio. I had asked him out.
Yes.
I was giving them to my relatives and wasn't keeping one myself. I opened one up early.
Ah,
My
yes.
sister got a used one. She doesn't know. And she doesn't live in this area, so she won't care. But I was able to keep my cell phone going.
I have a little gizmo that you can burn cardboard in, right? And it'll charge your cell phone. I mean, it's.
But
yeah.
that was, I'm bought one for myself now.
See,
And
yeah.
it got
Yeah.
radio,
Flashlight.
flashlight. I could read by it, but I didn't have to worry about charging my cell phone.
Well, I'm glad that everybody was here this evening to discuss this. Glenn, can you tell me one thing? Now, do your students, do they move out into these fields afterwards? Are there jobs in emergency preparedness?
It's actually a field that's growing. The
I'll
research
bet.
in it, there's actually a program at, I think now at Texas A&M. So someone who's serious about this can actually pursue it as a degree, path and profession. More things are opening up.
Well, we'll return to this topic frequently. I want to thank Representative Sam Singh from East Lansing and Glenn Stutzky from Michigan State. This is a topic I want to return to frequently, and I hope as the news comes out from the Board of Water and Light Commission that's looking at these issues, we'll learn a little more. Thank you very much. We'll see everybody else here next Monday night. This is WLNZ 89.7 LCC Radio here in Lansing, Michigan. And tune in next week where we're going to be talking about some more exciting issues. See you then. Let's see if that goes, and let's see.